So I'm going to try to answer two questions today. The questions are, how do students learn disciplinary content in a second language? And that's something I did my PhD on. So this is, in a sense, a little bit old. Some of you might even know newer stuff than that. And I'm also going to talk about what does it mean to become disciplinary literate in a second language. But I thought that I might start out by telling you a little story. It's a story about a mouse. And now I'm going to have my hands here. I'm not used to talking without my hands. I have to have both hands here. A mouse woke up one morning, and he was feeling really hungry. And he looked outside his hole, and there was a little piece of cheese. It's like, ah, fantastic, it's breakfast time. But then he stopped and he thought to himself, hang on a minute, maybe there's a cat out there, and this is all a trap. So he stopped and he listened, and he heard meow. So he went back to bed. The next morning, he woke up, and there was an even bigger piece of cheese outside his hole. And he's absolutely starving at this stage, but he still had the self-control to stop and listen, and he heard meow. And so he had to go back to bed again. On the third day, he's absolutely starving, and there's this massive piece of cheese, and you know what's going to happen. So he stops. He still manages to stop and listen, and he goes, woof, woof. Fantastic. The cat couldn't be in the kitchen when the dog was around, and so he ran out, and it's breakfast time. Oh, yeah, but for whom? That night, the cat was heard boasting to his lady friend, you see, that's the benefit of a second language. Now, we know that there are many benefits of learning a second language, but we also know that there are a number of issues. So first, let's look at learning in our first language and see what people have said about that. This is what Halliday and Martin say. Language isn't passively reflecting some pre-existing conceptual structure. On the contrary, it's actively engaged in bringing such structures into being. What they're saying is that knowledge isn't there and then you make language about it. It's bound up in the language. Almost all of what we customarily call knowledge is language, which means that the key to understanding a subject is to understand its language. Similarly, learning any subject depends on learning the language. So disciplinary learning could be viewed as a form of discourse change, finding a different way of speaking. So what we know then is that our relationship between disciplinary learning and our first language isn't straightforward. Learning's linked up with language, and all learning can be viewed as language learning, even in a monolingual setting. And I usually talk to university lecturers, and what I say to them is a university lecturer is a teacher of disciplinary discourse. And the goal, if you like, of university teaching is the production of disciplinary literate graduates. So that's in the first language, but what about in a second language? Well, there's been quite a bit of research, and many of you will know about this. It started with the Canadian Bilingual Immersion Studies, where they have French and English in Canada, and people with an English L1 were taught in French, and they were taught all their subjects in French. And there's a large number of studies, but they're all at compulsory school level, and we're on this adult track, yeah? The conclusion, though, from those studies is there's no noticeable effect on student learning. So it doesn't matter if you give them this in another language. At the end of the day, they come out knowing the subject, and they know this other language as well for free, which is great. There are also some... Oh, Helps if I press both buttons at once. There are also some European and Swedish studies. In Europe, we talk about CLIL, which is Content and Language Integrated Learning. In Sweden, there's this term SPRINT. I don't know how you get SPRINT out of that, but if you choose carefully, you might manage it. And again, most studies claim the results are similar. There's no negative effect. You're getting 2 for 1. But all these studies have got several features in common. They've focused on language learning, so they haven't really tested the content learning. They're interested in, do they learn French? Or do they learn Swedish or whatever? Or in Maria's case, she's next door, I think, do they learn English? They don't pay so much attention to subject knowledge, and they deal with lower levels of schooling. So this has been criticized a long time ago, actually. Both Mette Lorenz and Patsy Duff suggested that limitations in your second language might inhibit students' ability to explore abstract concepts. So if it's something, as you go further up, you move from concrete things to abstract things like democracy, politics, and then it becomes more difficult because you can't touch these things, so you can't just say, well, this is it, this is what I'm talking about. And so they're suggesting that maybe there's a problem when you come higher up, and most of the stuff's been at lower levels. And this appears to have been confirmed by Marsh, Howe, and Kong. And that's where I started my work. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. Because I think it was really clever, but then I wouldn't I? So this is a study that I did. Obviously, I'm working in physics, but I'm interested in this dual language approach that we have. Because at university level, we'll teach physics in English, or we'll teach it in Swedish, and often we don't even know which it's going to be when we turn up. Oh, there are a couple of exchange students. Oh, right, well, it's going to be in English. So what I did is I looked around in Sweden for people who were learning physics as part of the regular program. They were reading 2 courses in parallel, one in English and one in Swedish. So they're reading physics. They're reading 2 courses in parallel. One of them's in English and one of them's in Swedish. And then I went and videoed lectures from both of these. And then I interviewed 22 students. And I interviewed them individually. And I used video clips from the lecture to actually help them to remember. And I asked them to describe and explain concepts in Swedish and in English. It was kind of messy because first you dealt with something that they'd learned in Swedish, say, and then you get them to explain about it, maybe in English. Then you need a little space, and then you want to get them to explain about it in Swedish. And then you want to talk about the other course, which was taught in English, and then you want to take them to... So you end up with 4 different transcripts in 2 pairs talking about the same concepts in English and Swedish, and in English and Swedish, depending on which language they were taught in as well. So we can go back with this pair, and they say they were taught in Swedish, and go back with this pair and say that they were taught in English for that. And it's the same person. Yeah. So this gives you 2 types of results. It tells you something about the student ability to describe and explain in English and Swedish the concepts that they meet in lectures as a function of the lecture language. Yeah, are you with me so far? And it also tells us something about student learning patterns. So let's look at this first thing first. What I found was that students speak on average 45% slower in their English descriptions. So when they talk about something, whether it was taught in English or in Swedish, it doesn't matter. They talked about 45% slower. Now, this is kind of unfair because they didn't know that we were going to have to talk about these things in English. But again, they didn't know that they were going to have to talk about them in Swedish either. In Swedish, In English, it's more difficult. However, if you look at it from a physics point of view, the quality of the descriptions was pretty much the same. So there wasn't any difference. That doesn't mean anything. It doesn't tell us anything about teaching and learning in English or in Swedish. But what it does tell us is if you've learnt something, then you can either say it in English or in Swedish. If you try to say it in English and you're Swedish, then it's going to be kind of slow, but the knowledge is kind of there. And that is also whether it's good or bad. So, I mean, if you've got something incorrect, picked up something incorrectly, then it'll be just as incorrect in both languages. However, this is for most people. However, there were some students who had serious problems describing concepts in English. So 3 of these 22, they just couldn't do it. They'd say a couple of English words and then they just switched to Swedish. And of course they knew I could speak Swedish because I've just been asking them questions in Swedish. So I couldn't hide. The interesting thing about these, they were all first-year students and they'd never been taught in English before. They didn't have any problems talking about their everyday language. So we're talking about this thing, this disciplinary literacy that we're trying to get hold of, yeah? And the question is, that we don't know because we didn't follow these people up, is do they just adapt? Is it just something that's going to function in a few weeks or a month's time? Or do they just drop out? Because we have a lot of dropout in physics. And we don't know. And we still don't know because we didn't do any more work on that. But I thought I'd tell you, show you something about what this could look like. What one of the people who code switches, what they would say is that I didn't understand why it wasn't a real, vad ska jag säga, tal. Only when you har det upphöjt till 2. But she said it was ett sånt där tal. So what's interesting is that all the disciplinary words, number and squared and imaginary, are missing. But if any of you read my abstract for this thing or the thing in Lisetten, you'd know that I said, you don't have to teach this. I'm saying as a lecturer, this is stuff they're going to pick up. It's just that this was the first time that they met these words. And they'd never had to say these in English. And also, they weren't given the time, because I just asked them, what's this? But interestingly, the other, 18? I can't add up. But the other people all managed to talk about this. So anyway, these are the findings that I had. Students report no difference in their learning when taught in Swedish or in English. Now, this is really, really interesting. So the students themselves said, it doesn't matter which language he teaches in. It's just the same. You know, she can come and she can teach in English or in Swedish. It doesn't matter. However, when I showed them the video, there were all these differences that came out. So it was lucky that I did that because, I mean, you know, you're there, you give them a sandwich and you say to them, you know, and they say, I'm sorry, John, but I have to say, there's no difference at all when you say... but actually, the same people, and this was the power of the work, that the same people who've just said, there's no difference, then report a load of differences when they see the video. Oh, yeah, it's always like that. So... let's look at those differences. So when taught in English, the students ask and answer fewer questions. So there's a narrower shared space of learning. People who take notes have got difficulty following the lecture, so they could either do one or the other. They could write things down but not really know what they've written, or they could follow the lecture but not have any notes. So the success of those students appears to depend on them doing a lot of extra work to make sense of the notes afterwards. In other words, to do, if you like, the lecture for themselves at home with the notes that they've made. Interestingly, though, what I found most interesting was that students adapted their study habits. They asked questions after the lecture. They stopped taking notes in class. read sections of work before class. Now, this is something, remember, we've got Swedish and English, so oh, do you do that for the Swedish? Oh, no, we don't do that in Swedish. But when it's English, I'll read it beforehand. Or, in the worst case, these people, they just used the lecture as a mechanical note-taking. It was just, I am a copying machine, and then I'll go home and make sense of it. So from that, I need to get through this quickly now. I just realized that we're spending all the time. And this wasn't the bit I was going to talk about. The following is 7 recommendations that I had for lecturers, so content teachers, which I assume might not be you, but so discuss the fact that there are differences. Remember, the students said there were no differences. They thought strongly, they really believed that. In fact, it was in some cases embarrassing because they just told me there are no differences, and then they say all of these differences, and I'm kind of okay. I don't want to make it feel for them that this is really embarrassing, but no differences, and then a whole list of them. It seems to be reasonable to create opportunities for students to ask and answer questions, so it's a BQ or that type of thing, so group work. Also, I think it's good to allow time after the class for people to come out and ask questions. Because I mean, I've got this one thing where a guy talks and talks and talks, just like I'm doing now. And then, at the end, all these people come out and they've all got questions. And of course, they're all in Swedish. Ask students to read material before a lecture. This is a utopian thing. But actually, some of the students had done that, so I think you can sell it that way. There are these differences, and students we know have got around it by doing this. Somebody might buy it. It's worth a chat. The other thing is this thing to do with note-taking. If they're having a lot of trouble writing stuff down, why make them write it down? Why not give out your notes? The good thing about that was also that they could just write something on the notes so to make it make sense for them. So it becomes their notes in that way. The interesting thing as well is that usually at universities we have big lectures like this to introduce new material. But it seems like that's the worst thing that could happen when it's in a second language, because there are all these new words that they can't cope with and all these new ideas. So that seems to be something that you can think about. And then also something that came out was this multi-channel idea, that instead of just talking, there's also slides, there's paper, anything that gets them. But of course that these things should all be saying the same thing and not different things, because that would make it worse. And then because I'm English, I always cheat and I have an extra one, which is don't use lectures at all. So this type of thing, use seminar or group work, and perhaps adopt a flipped classroom, because then they could stop the lecture and listen and so on. So I had a final thing, and then we're going to have a little bit of time for you to talk. I did some follow-up research on this in South Africa, and I asked physics lecturers what they thought about their students and what their disciplinary literacy goals were for their students. And I asked them about language. And the main thing that came out is, but if I had to spend time doing that, I'd never teach them any physics. So it seems to me that until lecturers see their role as one of socializing students into the discourse of the discipline, you can't discuss disciplinary literacy goals. Lecturers seem to continue to insist that they're not language teachers, and this is a job for somebody else, and I guess some of you guys, yeah? So all teachers are language teachers, and then how do you get that across to your colleagues? I said I was going to try to answer 2 questions. The second question, what does it mean to become disciplinary literate in a second language? So there's one thing about becoming disciplinary literate. What does that mean? What does it mean to do that in a second language? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So when I was doing that work that I talked about, I found that language alone wasn't sufficient. There were other representations, other semiotic resources that seemed important. At first I had thought, okay, I'll do it this way. I'll have 3 languages. I've got English, I've got Swedish, and I've got mathematics, because there's all this mathematics, and it seems to be. And then after a while, I just say, oh, just chuck in the towel and say that everything, all of these things, graphs, diagrams, mathematics, lab work, they're actually moving things about physically, and spoken language is written languages, hearing, reading, all of these things. And so I ended up with a multimodal approach. Here you won't see any language at all, but the idea was trying to point out that there are different constellations of resources that are needed. Most of them are coordinated through language. But you need to maybe do some experimental work, draw some diagram and so on. And there's a question mark there, because actually we have no idea. We have no idea in physics, and I guess in the most disciplines, what is it that makes this knowledge? We just assume that, well, we talk and we do stuff and then somehow they get it. And I think as an educational researcher, that's not particularly satisfying. I think we should be able to go in and find out what sets of things are needed. Perhaps not what makes somebody learn, but if this thing's missing, it's not possible to learn. That's a more interesting way of flipping it around, I think. So if without that graph, it's not possible to actually see the thing that they're talking about. The interesting thing about this is it's going to differ from discipline to discipline. And here I draw on the work of Bernstein. He's best known for his work on codes. And I'm not going there at all, just so that if any sociolinguists here, Bernstein's best known for talking about there being a restricted code and an elaborated code. Middle-class families would have this elaborated code. There'd be a lot of books around, and they would fit normally into universities, whereas lower working-class families don't have that input, and they're working with a restricted code. Actually, I think the ideas are not so bad, but the terms are really terrible. Because what they suggest is that there's this developed thing, and then there's this totally undeveloped people. So the terms were universally condemned. Actually, I'm not going to talk about that at all. I'm more interested in his work on disciplinary knowledge structures. I'm going to talk very quickly about that because I think it just highlights one aspect of something that we're going to talk about here. So Bernstein classified disciplinary knowledge structures as hierarchical or horizontal. Hierarchical knowledge structures, the new knowledge has to be integrated with the old knowledge. Everything has to fit. Horizontal knowledge structures, the new knowledge is a new perspective. It's not supposed to fit. So knowledge grows, so in hierarchical knowledge structures, knowledge grows by explaining more and more in the same system. And where I come from, science, that's hierarchical. You can't just make a new theory to explain something new that comes along. It's got to explain everything the old theory did as well. And Martin talks about this like a triangle, where you're spreading out the base to include more and more things. We can look at it like this, that knowledge expands outwards, so to include new phenomena. So if we, working in my area, Newtonian physics, at the turn of the century, we thought we'd got this triangle and everything was fine, and then along came quantum mechanics and, if you like, expanded it out this way, and there's a better description. It describes everything that Newtonian physics does and this new stuff. So Newtonian mechanics becomes a subset of quantum mechanics. But we had a bit of a problem because we also got this thing called general relativity spread out the other way, and that also explains Newtonian physics, but it doesn't explain quantum mechanics. So we're kind of in a mess in physics, and this is where we are now. But we believe that there's a grand unified theory, a way of putting these things together, because that's what physics does. That's the way that we work. But what about these horizontal knowledge structures? The opposite. Horizontal knowledge grows by finding new ways to interpret the world. And it's not necessary for one interpretation to be coherent with another. In fact, that's the point. It's the new perspective that's important. So, knowledge is context dependent, and it's also disputed. There are different ways of talking about, thinking about different things, and that's what we see. That's why we've got different political parties, different structures, all sorts of things like that, because we look at things differently. If you use this way of looking, you get this, and if you look this, then you get that. Humanities, social sciences are more horizontal. Bernstein says that this is like creating whole new languages again and again and again. So we've got one and then another language to describe. So knowledge expands by creating these new languages. The languages don't have to be compatible with another. So, for example, if you have a post-colonial interpretation of a situation, you could also have a feminist interpretation of that situation, or a Marxist, or any other perspective that you want to put on it, and they will come up with different things, and that's the point. So you've got these two polarized ways of thinking about disciplinary knowledge, which, of course, what I'm arguing is that that affects this thing that we call disciplinary literacy. So that's why I'm talking about this, if somewhat quickly, I hope. So we've got things like, oops, sorry. Yeah, we've got more hierarchical. So not 100% hierarchical, but more hierarchical on one end and more horizontal on the other. So actually, you know, this is a generalization. So we've got sciences like physics and biology, and we've got history and literary studies. So what about the stuff in the middle? The stuff that everybody does? Well, the social sciences, you know, linguistics, sociology, education, if you like. Well, we could say that they're building small triangles. Vignell talks about warring triangles. So that instead of having these different languages and realizing this is just a different perspective, now we have a little fight because we're building our triangle that explains this. So what I'm trying to argue is that what constitutes disciplinary literacy will differ from discipline to discipline and also from case to case. And for this to make sense, I need to define what I mean by disciplinary literacy. So finally, we get to what this is about. Okay, so, oh, good grief, this is all messed up. Yeah, there. So for me, disciplinary literacy refers to the ability to appropriately participate in the communicative practices of a discipline. Now, there's a reason for choosing those words very carefully. The first thing is the appropriate participation. How do you know you're disciplinary literate? Well, how do you know you're a physicist? Well, the other physicists seem to accept you as one, so you must be, yeah? There isn't really a sort of test, or you know, there isn't really a test for that. The only test is, do you get accepted as a physicist? It's what James Paul G talks about, pulling off a discourse. He says, you know, what do I need to do to get myself accepted as a particle physicist? Have to dress in a certain way, say certain things at certain times and so on. And then suddenly that's what there isn't any outside criteria. That it's just I'm accepted by everybody else. And then the reason for taking communicative practices is because, at least in science, we've got these things like mathematics, graphs, diagrams. So it's all of the things that I send out as signals that say, I'm a physicist. And then I hopefully get back signals that say, yeah, all right, we agree. Precisely, if you say so. So yeah, so it's a focus on these communicative practices. To actually unpack that a little bit more, I'd like to look at what is literacy. And I don't know what, so I was teaching all yesterday, so I don't know what you've been saying in your discussions about disciplinary, about literacy as such. But I have my own take on it, and I'll tell you, and then you can shoot me down. It's really difficult to translate into Swedish, and because in English it's got two distinct meanings. It's got literacy in a fundamental sense, and we've got literacy in a derived sense. So the fundamental sense is this thing that we usually think about when we think about literacy, which is the idea of being able to read and write. That's what literacy is. But in a derived sense, it's a metaphor, and it talks about either familiarity or competence with something. In my PhD, we had, just at that time, came in this demand that you had to have a summary in Swedish. And so then I had this thing, and I needed to translate it somehow. And actually, the way that I translated it was not litteracitet, because I think you lose a lot when you use that, because the metaphor disappears, or you need to actually put it there for some reason. So what I used was ämneskompetens to talk about, but that was what I was doing, and of course it won't work in every situation. But it is a metaphor. So when literacy is used together with something else, mathematical literacy, biological literacy, computer literacy, it's talking about this familiarity or this competence with something. So yeah, and that's what I've said there. Okay, I was talking about James Paul G, and this is where I came from when I talked about disciplinary literacy. So what G does is a very nice little move, I think. He says, okay, we've got one thing called this primary discourse, and this is the language, the oral language that we learn as a child. Actually, it's still a little bit messy. Some of you will be saying, yeah, but this kid's got 3 languages, or but in general, at least, one primary discourse, the oral language we learn as a child, and then many secondary discourses, the specialized communicative practices that you use outside the home. And what Guy says is, yeah, literacy is fluency in these secondary discourses. So for him, there's this primary discourse, and then everything else is literacy. It's translating, learning how to act, say, be, in these other situations outside where your first primary discourse is. So from that, if we take that, then literacy depends on the site, in other words, where it's used. So I'm just looking at the time. We are on time-ish. So when I talk about disciplinary literacy, what site am I referring to? Well, I suggest that the disciplinary literacy course of a degree course are going to be a mix of fluency, that Guy was talking about, for 3 different sites. The academy, that's the university, the workplace, and for society in general. Now, the academy is kind of obvious, yeah? It's kind of obvious that if it's disciplinary literacy, when you learn the discipline, but then there's the role of, oh yeah, but I'm going to go and be a physicist at a workplace. I'm going to go and be whatever it is I learned to be and use that knowledge in my workplace. And I'm also going to be that in society. It's who I identify myself as. And so then I need to actually be able to perform that identity in society as well. So, disciplinary literacy, I suggest at university level, we're trying to develop literacy for 3 sites, but from a disciplinary perspective, yeah? So we've got this academy, society and workplace, and so you can say each of these are making different demands on language. So the workplace needs certain things, society needs certain things from you as a historian, teacher, nurse, whatever it is. And the academy also places different demands on you linguistically. So what we end up with is this triangle, and you can say we could place different disciplines at in different situations in different places. When I talk to physicists about where they place themselves, it's right down here. If they could go a little bit further, it would be, this is where physicists think they are. But that's because physicists, as physicists, are not engineers. So engineers, they say they're in the middle. They like to think that, at least. Where we have the academy and we've all this knowledge, but we've got a workplace, and I'm an engineer, and I do stuff for society by being an engineer. So I'm right in the middle, yeah. A historian maybe would put themselves on this axis, on this side. Society and academy, there aren't that many jobs as historians. So, whereas there are more practical-based disciplines would perhaps put themselves on the workplace society side, and there's less use for this academic knowledge once I get out there. It's all about being able to do, yeah? And to be able to do good in society as a nurse, teacher, whatever it might be. Okay, so this is the way that I conceptualize disciplinary literacy. What does that say to you if you deal with language? Well, this is a single language. So if we're in a monolingual setting, all of these things apply. So in your L1, this is what we've got. But then as we go to L2, there are different demands. There's a different triangle. There are different things that you need to be able to do. And the same if we go to L3 and so on. So there are lots of, just because as a physicist I need to be able to do something in the academy in English, that doesn't necessarily mean I have to be able to do exactly the same thing in Swedish. There's all this talk about in the Nordic countries about parallel language use. But parallel doesn't mean just as much of each, and for all of the jobs, although I think Ole Josefsson maybe would like it to be there. I think that more pragmatically, there are different jobs and there are different things. If we can only choose to teach people, we've only got a limited amount of time with them. It'd be nice if they could do everything, but they need to be able to do this in English, they need to be able to do this in Swedish. And it's more important that we get those things sorted out first. So, in order to be able to talk about that, which is what I'm going to get you to do now, if we've got any time, I brought this together in something which is called a disciplinary literacy discussion matrix, and it sounds really, really good, but actually it's actually really dumb when you look at it, but it kind of works, I think. There are 3 columns in this matrix, and these 3 columns are the 3 sites in society. So you've got the academy, the workplace, and society. Cool. Now we're all right. And then the rows of the matrix are the languages and what you need to do with them. So then you can, basically, you've got these 3 sites, and then you've got different languages and the other modes, so graphs and diagrams and stuff. And it looks like this. So, yeah, so we've got reading, writing, and speaking in different languages, your first language and in Swedish. And then what do you need it for? What I'd like you to do now, come along and give you some of these, is to talk with the person next to you. Now, this is what these physics lecturers that I talked to that said, we don't do language, this is what they had to do. I said to them, what are your disciplinary literacy goals for your students? And so I thought you could do the same thing now. Talk to the person next to you and tell them about what your disciplinary literacy goals for your students are. Just point to the bits and explain. And then let your partner do that too. Basically what I'm trying to suggest is that this is a way of talking with your colleagues about the goals that you have, what you're doing, but also with people who are disciplinary experts, those colleagues, and try to say, oh, so what are we doing and why? And we found that it was reasonably good at eliciting what people thought. So it's a very simple thing to put in front of you, but it helps people to talk about these issues. To summarize for today, I've said that literacy is a metaphor. It's got these fundamental and derived senses. By the way, I didn't come up with that. I just haven't put the Norris and Phillips reference in. So, literacy is multimodal, and I define disciplinary literacy as this ability to appropriately participate in communicative practices of a discipline. I also said that each discipline fosters a unique form of disciplinary literacy for society, academy, and the workplace. And the demands placed on language and these other representational modes are different in each of these three sites. Then you can divide it up into this local or international form. Local forms are probably going to be having a local language, whereas international forms, at least to a large extent, are dominated by English in my discipline. And I'm suggesting that this discussion matrix might be a useful tool for you to help you discuss what your disciplinary literacy goals are. What a lovely way to finish. Okay.